As it turns out, you probably owe the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for some of your favorite games, or at the very least members of it. Have you ever enjoyed slaughtering demons in Doom? Then you owe a thank you to one Mormon in particular, a Mr. Sandy Petersen. Did you enjoy building civilization in Age of Empires? Then say thank you to Sandy. Have you played basically any Cthulhu-themed tabletop game in the past 40 years? Then you definitely need to say thank you to Mr. Petersen.
He's so ugly! I love him!
You see, I was born and raised in the church. Maybe it's because I didn't grow up in Utah around a lot of other Mormons, but I've always felt like there's a major disconnect between the recreation I enjoyed and my own personal faith. Now that's not uncommon by any stretch of the imagination, I will totally admit that. I mean, one look at modern Hollywood will show you God is not there. However, many of my friends of other religions had at least surface-level representation in the media. Meanwhile, the most famous representation of my faith in mainstream pop culture is a Tony Award-winning musical designed to insult us. Instead of being the type of loser who is insulted by the South Park guys, I want to elevate the stories of members of the church, Mormons as we're more colloquially known, that we do get in popular culture. While there aren't many of them, it is surprising where you can find us sometimes. Be they real or fictional, there are some great members of the faith out there in the world for you to see. For instance, I've already dedicated a few videos to my love of Brandon Sanderson novels, which you should watch, by the way. You can also like and subscribe to the channel while you're at it. And, with that said, with all that in mind, I want to introduce you to the master of all things Lovecraftian, the builder of Doom itself, Sandy Petersen. The place was St. Louis, Missouri. The day, September 16th, 1955. Sandy Petersen is born. What I actually mean is that Carl Sanford Jocelyn Petersen is born. I mean, yeah, I can see why he keeps it shortened to Sandy. Now, Carl Sanford here developed an interest in three things pretty early in life. The first would be games. Given the date range of his childhood, I'm talking about physical games. Board games, strategy games, card games. He eventually became interested in video games and role-playing games as such things were being invented. The second major interest of Sandy's life would be the written work of early 20th century American writer and all-around basket case, Howard Phillips Lovecraft. You can call him HP. Apparently, back in the day, and by that I mean way, way back in the day, Sandy's father, Mr. Petersen, was a major fan of really old-school science fiction, and I mean the early pulp stuff. One day, an approximately 8-year-old Sandy is poking around in boxes of Dad's old junk in the basement. On this particular day, he found a 1942 printing of Dunwich Horror and Other Stories, and was instantly enthralled. Like I can only assume a character in a Lovecraft novel would be if they found a mysterious old book in their basement. Unfortunately for young Sandy, this was basically the only Lovecraft he had access to. Not for lack of trying either. In the late 60s, a now teenage Sandy would be visiting his local university library, where he'd find that this library had a first edition copy of Lovecraft's Arkham House books. Unfortunately for him, only a couple years after that, said library realized that first editions of those things go for hundreds of dollars and locked them away where a high schooler wasn't going to get to them. Sorry, kid. The third major interest of young Sandy's life was, in fact, dinosaurs. Because, he was a young boy. Find me one who isn't thrilled by them. The dinosaur thing is important because that would contribute to him studying zoology at, hey, now would you look at that, it's Brigham Young University. After graduating, Petersen would set out for University of California, Berkeley to try to get his master's in entomology. College was a really formative time for Sandy, as that was the first time he played a little game known as Dungeons and Dragons.
I am Dungeon Master, your guide in the realm of Dungeons and Dragons.
It was quite literally a little game back then. You see, Sandy was playing the very first printing of D&D. However, according to him, D&D's early rules were so terribly written that everyone would just make up their own rules.
There's only one rule. Are you ready? Here it is. There are no rules. Go!
Now, eventually, Sandy would get hooked on a game called RuneQuest, another early role-playing game that was being made by Chaosium Inc., a game company that was started by Greg Stafford in 1975. Chaosium put out RuneQuest, which was made by another guy named Steve Perrin in 1978. Over the next couple of years, Chaosium would refine their RuneQuest model into basic role-playing, a generic role-playing game model that could be adapted at will into any genre that people really wanted. I tell you all this because this is where Sandy Petersen would make his first forays into professional game design. I put professional in quotes there because Sandy had already been making new things and adjusting pre-built games for years at this point, both as a kid and a young adult. It just so happens that right about now is when he found a way to get paid for it. Petersen, an avid RuneQuest player at this point, contacted the little Chaosium company to see if he could put his knowledge of Cthulhu lore to work for them. And he wanted to make a supplement for RuneQuest based on Lovecraft's work. After making a few minor pieces for them, he was put in charge of using the BRP system to make a new game that would become the cult classic tabletop game Call of Cthulhu.
And it's Cthulhu! Of course it's Cthulhu! Who else would it be? We got Cthulhu!
Call was an immediate hit at the time, which led to more editions and more printings and more money for the company. After release, Sandy would get a part-time job at Chaosium as just a typesetter, really, but he wasn't fully satisfied. I mean, not with his work at the company, with his schooling. You see, Sandy was still doing grad school, but his interest in gaming was so big that it was about now that he decided to quit school altogether, and he became a full-time game designer for Chaosium. And now is about the time where Chaosium would enter into a licensing agreement with a company called Avalon Hill, whose list of published tabletop games is really long. You made a board game called Arab-Israeli Wars? Why? You see, Avalon Hill had the opportunity to get in on the ground floor of role-playing games. They were the premier name in the wargaming industry, the precursor to the modern role-playing game. Which is why, in 1974, a young developer by the name of Gary Gygax approached Avalon Hill to pitch his new game idea, Dungeons & Dragons. Avalon Hill passed, so Gygax would make his own company, Tactical Studies Rules, just to sell D&D. And TSR would become the dominant player in the tabletop game within less than 5 years. Naturally, Avalon Hill wanted to make up for their massive miss and get into the RPG sphere. They do this by making some of their own games and licensing RuneQuest in 1983. The basic setup was that Avalon Hill would handle manufacturing and marketing for games, while Chaosium would handle design and development. Sandy would work on a couple different projects during this time, most notably the 1986 release of the Ghostbusters RPG, which was made as part of a collab between Chaosium and West End Games. Ghostbusters had a lot of systems that would serve as the basis for West End's eventual Star Wars RPG. Unfortunately, Chaosium just wasn't bringing in the dough. I mean, Sandy was living in a crappy Berkeley apartment, and he had a young family to raise. One day, Sandy approached Greg Stafford. He explained his situation, and he made it clear that he was going to start looking for work elsewhere. Stafford was apparently really sad to see him go. While he couldn't offer Petersen the money that he would need to keep him, Greg Stafford did give Sandy a small portion of company stock as a goodbye present, which I think reflects well on the relationship the two had and the respect they both had for game development. Now, Sandy was a pretty smart guy, and he loved games of all sorts. Now, seeing as it was the late 80s by this point in our story, Sandy realized that the real market to get into was the one that was really starting up in earnest: video games. One day while at Gen Con, Sandy Petersen met Lawrence Schick, a designer who worked for a company called Microprose. Lawrence offered Sandy a job with the company, which naturally Sandy took. He packed up and he moved his family across the country to Microprose's Baltimore office. Sandy put in a bunch of work for Microprose and wound up contributing to some pretty groundbreaking stuff. Sandy played a key role in Command HQ, which is often considered one of the earliest real-time strategy games, and the first with head-to-head online multiplayer. He also worked on Sid Meier's Pirates, one of the first games that used Sid Meier's name as a selling point. He even had a minor hand in the very first Civilization game. At this point, you should probably just assume that if it was a famous strategy game, Sandy Petersen probably had his hands on it somewhere. However, things weren't going well for Microprose from a business perspective. After a series of bad flops and, according to Sandy, some horrific management, the company was really struggling. In one instance, a game known as Darklands, Sandy was put in a pretty high position during development, but after a number of delays, the president of the company would overrule the protests of both Sandy and the quality assurance department and ship the game before it was ready. And it flopped really hard. Sandy says the game had 40,000 returns in the first 3 months on the market. At one point, Sandy was working at 5 projects for Microprose all at the same time. Now, a sane company might assume that this makes him a valuable employee because he's capable of taking on a wide workload. But all the floundering Microprose saw is that this guy is expendable. And Sandy Petersen was laid off in 1992. Sandy cites the next 5 months as among the worst periods in his life. Being out of work, a family to support, and having just suffered at the hands of truly terrible management, I'm sure Sandy Petersen was just about at his wit's end. Eventually, though, a friend got him a job interview at this tiny company in Texas called id. Sandy was really excited about this, not only for the chance to work again, but because id had already made a game called Wolfenstein 3D, a game Sandy absolutely loved. Sandy had been wanting to make a zombie-based shooting game for a long time, but Microprose simply didn't have the means to make it how Sandy wanted to make it. In the interview, Sandy was shown id's next project, a little shareware shooter called Doom. Here it was, the video game Sandy had always wanted to make. Sandy's involvement with Doom and id as a company went far beyond just working as a member of the team. According to Sandy, when he started at the company, id was in the middle of a little internal battle. The company's leaders and primary programmers, the Johns, Romero, and Carmack, were of the opinion that designers weren't really necessary for games. Meanwhile, the art team, led by Kevin Cloud and Adrian Carmack, were begging for designers to help them put the game together. The compromise was that one designer would be brought onto the company, and that designer was Sandy Petersen. Sandy ultimately would be the designer credited with literally every single level in the 3rd episode of Doom. He also personally edited maps for the other episodes, and when it came time for Doom 2, Sandy would design over half the levels himself. Sandy also makes the claim that he was the one who properly implemented Doom's BFG. According to a recent X thread, Sandy says the original BFG only fired a giant spray of plasma, but it wasn't really effective because it had no real range. Petersen pitched a grenade launcher type gun that would insta-clear the room instead, and these two concepts were eventually merged together into the BFG we all know and love. Sandy's time at id wasn't entirely spent on Doom either. He played a hand in Quake's development before being sent on temporary assignment to the company Rogue Entertainment, who were licensing the Doom engine for their game Strife. John Romero credits Petersen for coming up with the title for an expansion to one of id's other projects, Hexen. Peter was apparently the one who named it Death Kings of the Dark Citadel. Then, when Quake was out of the R&D phase, Petersen would be the man who revised the story for the first game and made 7 levels for the game. Sandy was the one who made these games fun. Had Romero and Carmack had their way in the beginning, Doom would have been little more than just rooms full of random enemies. Sandy Petersen is why Doom and Quake had actual levels to explore. One of my favorite stories of Sandy Petersen's work on Doom is when John Romero first realized he was Mormon. Apparently, Petersen kept it as a footnote at the bottom of his resume. According to the book Masters of Doom by David Kushner, Romero was heavily against having someone who was actively religious working on his game. He said, and I quote, "I don't want anyone who's religious here. We're writing a game about demons and hell, and the last thing we need is someone who's going to be against it." Well, Sandy apparently impressed Romero with his skills so much that Romero had no choice but to accept it. Later, Romero would actually ask Peter about his faith, and the exchange went a little something like this. "So, you're Mormon?" "Yep." "Well, at least you're not a Mormon that keeps pumping out tons of kids and stuff." "Actually, I've got 5 kids." "Well, okay, I mean, that's not like 10 or anything, but, 5's a lot, but, at least you're not a card-carrying Mormon." "I got my Mormon card right here." "Well, at least you don't wear those garments and stuff, right?" "Got my garments right here." Okay, I'm going to shut up. "Look, don't worry. I have no problems with the demons in this game. They're just cartoons. And anyway, they're the bad guys." It's an outlook like this that really endears me to Sandy Petersen. After all, what could be more in line with God's desires than blasting the forces of hell into a fine paste? Unfortunately, Quake would shake up the company a bit too much. Pun definitely intended. Due to creative differences, animosity grew in the company and fights began to break out between Carmack and Romero. Romero ultimately left the company after Quake's release. He was followed shortly by many other members of staff, including Petersen. Petersen cites a lack of true leadership on Quake at the time and even went directly to Carmack so he could volunteer to be the team lead, but was ultimately turned down. Sandy's next stop in his career was Ensemble Studios. According to Sandy, the difference between id and Ensemble was that id was more like a pack of hyenas attacking a gazelle carcass. It's not going to look pretty, and there's going to be a lot of barking and growling at each other, but the group can pretty much handle that task without issue. Ensemble was more like a squad of veteran soldiers. Everyone knew their place and was loyal to the whole. Apparently, Petersen really liked his work with Ensemble, because this is the company he would stick at the longest. The first and most obvious gaming win for Ensemble and Petersen was the Age of Empires games. Sandy would work on Age of Empires starting with the first game in 1997, and would stay with the series until Age of Empires 3, whose last expansion came out in 2007. That wasn't even Sandy's last game with Ensemble. He would also work quite heavily on 2009's Halo Wars. So now we've got a guy who's got his fingers on yet another blockbuster franchise. Sandy also ran a popular series of threads on the old Heaven Games forums, where he would regularly interact with fans as an Ensemble studio employee. Tragically, Ensemble was not long for this world, and all good things must inevitably come to an end. You see, Microsoft had acquired Ensemble outright in 2001, and during the creation of Halo Wars in 2009, it was leaked to the staff that Microsoft was planning on laying off the entire company after the game came out. Why Microsoft would do this to an extremely profitable venture like Ensemble, no one has any definitive idea. Once news of the layoffs spread to the employees, Microsoft actually tried to buy up Ensemble's leaders, promising them jobs if they lied and said layoffs weren't happening. Ensemble leadership, to a man, resigned in protest. Eventually, Microsoft had to cut a deal, ensuring Halo Wars actually came out. The deal would give everyone an extremely generous severance package, and it signed a contract with a new company, forged from the ashes of the old company. This new company, called Robot Entertainment, would go on to make the Orcs Must Die franchise. By the time of Ensemble Studios' closure, Sandy was in his mid-50s. Many would consider trying to get a nice cush job for the next decade or so, and fade into retirement. Not Sandy. The man was nothing if not productive in any way, shape, or form. The next few years saw Sandy all over the map. His first job after Ensemble would be teaching game design at Southern Methodist University in Texas. In 2011, he would be the executive producer for a film called The Whisperer in Darkness, which was nominated for several film festival awards. He would be the publisher of a horror magazine, Arcane, Penny Dreadfuls for the 21st Century. Heck, in 2015, he and Greg Stafford even managed to return to Chaosium Inc. Sandy would serve on the board of the company until 2019, but still does freelance with them from time to time. Sandy Petersen's biggest success in this more modern time period would come in 2013. You see, Sandy decided to go solo and start his own company, Green Eye Games. The company had a very successful Kickstarter for their very first tabletop game, Cthulhu Wars, raising over $1.4 million, which is a staggering 3,500% more than the paltry $40,000 they were going for. The game now has several expansions, over 60 unique figures, and a bunch of other content. Petersen is still active with other pursuits as well. He's put out Cthulhu Mythos books for both Pathfinder and Dungeons & Dragons, and has published 7 other tabletop games since Cthulhu Wars, including the Orcs Must Die official board game. He also has a pretty active YouTube channel called Sandy of Cthulhu. I actually sourced a bunch of my information for this video from there. It's a really nice follow if you're interested in Lovecraftian lore or game design. He's routinely sharing stories of his time working on various projects over his career, talks about his philosophy and ideas around game design, and shares interesting things about Lovecraftian lore and horror stories as a whole. And that's been the career of Sandy Petersen. He started his career as a man who loved Lovecraft and games, maybe a bit too much, and he ended as a man who still loves Lovecraft and games, maybe a bit too much. I think that's really the thing about Sandy's story that's so appealing to me as a gamer. Sandy said that if he ever stopped loving games, he would stop making games and go do something else. Petersen makes games because he plays games. He loves games because they're games. It's that simple-minded love of what he does that I think everyone in the game industry could use just a little bit more of. Thank you all for watching. I'm Landon. This has been Landon-Core. Please like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!